All right, good to see you folks. Thanks for coming out. We understand that now we're on the downhill side of the quarter. Is that right? Depends how you count. Is week 6? This is the day. So hold your breath. In just 30 more seconds, you'll be on the downhill side of the quarter. But no, we know it's a long haul. We know there's a lot being asked of you school-wise, but also just to say it out loud one more time, we all appreciate that this is a really hard time for pretty much everybody, regardless of your political position. We all know that scary times, hard times, and to carve out time by whatever motivations to be here, we really do appreciate that. We're here to learn together. The topic we'll deal with tonight, reparations, is a theme that couldn't be more timely. And it's a theme that we at the CAP Center have been grappling with for some time, and we're getting ever more coordinated in our efforts to talk about it. We do lots of work on repatriation, the return of human remains and objects to Native communities, which is a very concrete form of reparations. And we're trying to begin to think creatively about what would it mean to extend from that kind of work to other forms of reparation, and to have a guide like Grace Cowell with us to help us think about the contours of these issues is a real gift. And again, very, very timely. So we're deeply appreciative. We'll have a formal introduction in just a moment. I'm Greg Johnson. I'm a professor of religious studies here, and I'm director of the Walter H. Cap Center for the Study of Ethics, Religion, and Public Life, and we're the sponsors tonight. And I want to thank Leilani Calkins in the back, our student helper, and she's about to graduate too. Give her a round of applause. She's been helping us out for a couple years, and so thank you, Leilani. And Dr. Dusty Hosley, the associate director of this center, coordinates so much of what we do, and he really took lead on tonight's event. So thank you. A round of applause for Dr. Hosley. Thanks, Dusty. We have a few events coming up that I want to draw your attention to. Next Tuesday evening, at the IV Theater at 5 p.m., we're doing a film screening and a discussion with two Hawaiian activists, a mother and daughter team, talking about protecting sacred places in Hawaii, and in particular talking about Mauna Kea and the 30-meter telescope conflict that comes quite home to this university insofar as Chancellor Yang is the chairman of the board of that telescope project. He's not necessarily the bad guy in all of this, but our institution is directly implicated in a major potential taking of Native Hawaiian sacred land that has activated that community in all kinds of ways, chiefly in spiritual and religious ways. And this mother-daughter team next Tuesday, it's a film screening about their efforts and a discussion with them. They're amazing. The mother is a kumu hula, a hula teacher. They're chanters. It'll be a great experience. So come out if you can. And again, it's really on the theme of reparations in some sense. The mountain on which this telescope might be built has been damaged. And the question is, how might it be restored? That's a form of reparations and protections. So next Tuesday, 5 p.m., IV Theater. You can find more info on our website. The following week, another theme, another talk that is related, and this is on the sanctuary movement, the history of the sanctuary movement in the United States by a young, brilliant scholar, Lloyd Barba. And he'll talk about that movement. That is May 8th, 5 p.m. in the Wallace Annenberg Conference Room, and that's in the Social Sciences and Media building just over there, okay? So look out for those events. Please come if you can. Then a land acknowledgement. You're probably aware, the students here, I'm sure, are aware that we're on Chumash land. Chumash peoples are alive and well. They're all around us in communities within Santa Barbara and around the county and beyond. They never ceded this land. They regard it as their homeland to this day. And that relationship with the university hasn't always been honored. In fact, it's been dishonored in many ways. I'd like to think we're turning the corner and doing better, but it behooves us all to keep pressure on our own administration to make good on the steps that we have taken to recognize Chumash people and to welcome them into this space to support their children in our university and so forth. So that's by way of my land acknowledgement. With that, please welcome up Dr. Dusty Hosley, who will introduce our special guest for the evening.
Thank you. And we are so grateful that you are here. And it's my honor and truly a privilege to introduce Dr. Grace Gao. This lecture tonight, Righting Wrongs When Sorry Isn't Enough, Constructing an Asian American Theology of Reparations, is part of a series of talks that we are hosting at the CAP Center on reparations and repair across a number of different contexts, communities, time periods, and geographies. The CAP Center is also grateful to our co-sponsors for this evening's lecture, the Departments of Religious Studies and Asian American Studies here at UC Santa Barbara, and we're proud to present this event with them. Grace Gao is Professor of Ethics and the inaugural Roy I. Sano and Kathleen A. Thomas Sano Professor in Pacific and Asian American Theology at the Claremont School of Theology, where she is also the founding co-director of the Center for Sexuality, Gender, and Religion. She is the author of Grounding Human Rights in a Pluralist World and My Body, Their Baby, a Progressive Christian Vision for Surrogacy, and co-editor of 2 books, Asian American Christian Ethics and Encountering the Sacred, Feminist Reflections on Women's Lives. She's authored many articles and book chapters and has provided commentary for CNN, MSNBC, NPR, and elsewhere. Professor Gao serves on the board of directors for the Asian Pacific American Religions Research Initiative and the Pacific, Asian, and North American Asian Women in Theology and Ministry, and previously served on the board of directors for the Society of Christian Ethics. She's also won several awards for excellence in teaching. Without further ado, it is my great honor to introduce Dr. Grace Gao.
Since the waning decades of the 20th century, US and other Western states have arguably entered into an age of apology. In this era, victims of historic injustices have been demanding, and in some cases receiving, symbolic and material forms of redress. Scholars have been tracking and critically assessing attempts to make amends by heads of state, legislative bodies, religious communities, schools, and corporations. Redress activism in the present thus connect past misdeeds and oppressive systems to current realities and polities. They raise intergenerational justice questions about standing and responsibility. Is it right to press national or other bodies to apologize for the sins of their predecessors? Is it also fair to expect them to pay for the reparations? Well, we could approach these questions in myriad ways. I will do so tonight from the frameworks of human rights, Christian ethics and theology, and Asian American studies. Methodologically, I'll proceed as follows. In my first section, I'll provide snapshots of 4 case studies emerging from AAPI communities and experiences to set the context. In the second, I'll clarify the meaning and forms of reparations before identifying the human rights standards and theological commitments that will further guide my reflections. In my final section, I'll propose a non-exhaustive list of 5 theoethical principles. To be sure, as a Christian ethicist, I'll eventually need to address the role that forgiveness plays in the work of repair, but that question must remain for another time. And in fact, one of the main reasons why I'm not talking about forgiveness is that tends to be the first thing people say for Christians, forgive, as opposed to pursue justice. So I'm just gonna completely bracket that question. All right, so now let's turn to these cases. You'll soon see how my 4th case differs notably from the 3 others because Asian Americans stood on the giving, not receiving end of redress. All right, so first case study. This is Chinese Americans and the Exclusion Era. The Chinese Exclusion Act of 18 1882 was the first law in the US to bar immigration and naturalization for a single group of people due to their race or ethnicity. It lasted until its repeal in 1943 after China joined the Allies for the sake of PR. Chinese immigrants had been working as cheap labor in various industries, including mining, fishing, laundry, and the railroads, but were barred from participating in mainstream institutions, defamed as menacing and degenerate, such as, the Yellow Peril, and even ethnically cleansed from more than 300 communities in California and the Pacific Northwest. According to Congress's own admission, discussions from the late 19th to the mid-20th centuries were characterized by intensely racial rhetoric, with many members of Congress claiming that all Chinese were unworthy of American citizenship, incapable of assimilation, and dangerous to the political and social integrity of the US. Following redress activism by Asian American groups and a 2009 California bill apologizing for the state's history of anti-Chinese laws, the US Senate and House unanimously passed resolutions in 2011 and 2012 expressing regret for those 6 decades of federal legislation that had unfairly targeted Chinese people for physical and political exclusion. All right, so our next case study. This involves Japanese Americans. Within 24 hours of Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor, federal authorities seized and detained more than 700 Japanese Americans on fears of espionage. 600 more were rounded up the next day. When President Roosevelt issued Executive Order 9066 2 months later, more than 120 West Coast Japanese Americans, 2/3 of whom were native-born US citizens, were forcibly removed from their homes. Without ever being formally charged, Japanese Americans were first warehoused in detention sites on repurposed fairgrounds or racetracks, while 10 concentration camps were being built in the desolate terrain of 7 states. An organized community-wide campaign for redress emerged in the late 1960s with the rise of the Asian American movement and mobilization of the Japanese American Citizens League. When a congressional commission concluded that Executive Order 9066 had not been justified by military necessity, but that its true causes were race prejudice, war hysteria, and a failure of political leadership, the national conversation shifted from whether a wrong had been done to what must now be done to right it. President Reagan signed the Civil Liberties Act into law on August 10, 1988, which formally apologized for the grave injustice, established a civil liberties public education fund, and provided each surviving incarceree a $20,000 tax-free check. The Civil Liberties Act has generally been hailed as a success. Many Japanese American redress activists, however, believe the redress to be incomplete, given that the more than 2,200 ethnic Japanese from 13 Latin American countries who were likewise forcibly warehoused in the same concentration camps, and in some cases were deported to Japan in prisoner exchanges for American POWs. So these Japanese Latin Americans were deemed ineligible to receive the benefits of the Civil Liberties Act. All right, third case, and this involves Filipino American veterans. Within hours after the attack on Pearl Harbor, Japan invaded the Philippines. Less than 5 months before, and in the days following, more than 250,000 Filipinos were commissioned to fight under the US flag in the Pacific theater of World War II. Those forces included those serving in the Philippines military, whom President Roosevelt had called into service as colonial subjects. And so, as a historical reminder, the Philippines was a US territory until it gained independence in 1946. And secondly, those living in the US who were either drafted following a 1941 statute or who had enlisted after the Second War Powers Act had created a service pathway to citizenship. Now, despite the veterans' sacrificial service, especially during the now famous battles and infamous death march of Bataan and Corregidor, they were bitterly betrayed at war's end. Though promised full veteran benefits and a streamlined naturalization process, the Recessions Act of 1946 deemed the deployment of Filipinos prior to July 1st, 1946, not to have been active military or naval service for the purposes of any law of the United States conferring rights, privileges, or benefits. And the US also retracted their pathway to citizenship. Filipino veterans have been pressing for proper recognition of their service with equitable benefits ever since. And they have made some piecemeal gains, including a naturalization measure in the Immigration Reform Act of 1990, a 1996 presidential proclamation thanking them for their extraordinary sacrifices in defense of democracy and liberty, monetary reparations in 2009 to each eligible survivor of either $9,000 for non-US citizens and $15,000 for US citizens, and receipt of the Congressional Gold Medal in 2017. And that is the highest expression of national appreciation to an individual or group. Okay, so at this point, we're gonna move to my last case study. And as I mentioned before, this one's slightly different because Asian Americans are on the giving end. All right, so in response to the longstanding Hawaiian sovereignty movement, the General Synod of the United Church of Christ issued a formal apology in 1991 to Native Hawaiians for the church's complicity a centennial earlier in the illegal overthrow of the Kingdom of Hawaii. So another history lesson, the overthrow precipitated Hawaii's annexation by the US in 1898 and statehood in 1959. On January 17th, 1993, exactly 100 years to the day after the toppling of Queen Liliuokalani, the then president of the UCC formally repented of the ways the church had too often confused the ways of the West with the ways of Christ. He did so while pledging the denomination's support for Native Hawaiians in a major service of repentance and reconciliation, attended by more than 12,000 people outside of Honolulu's Royal Iolona Palace. The UCC also committed modest reparations, $1.25 million, for redress. After a period of discernment, the Asian American churches of the UCC Hawaii Conference enacted their own apology resolution at their annual meeting in 1993. They recalled their ancestors' disapproval of the Queen's dethroning and acknowledged that a certain bond had existed between Native Hawaiians and Asians during the first half of the 20th century, as both groups were outsiders to the white oligarchically controlled Hawaii. These Asian American Christians then confessed that, and this is a quote, "We as former immigrants have benefited socially and economically from the illegal overthrow, while we have disregarded the destruction of Native Hawaiian culture and the struggles of the Na Kanaki Maoli," which means indigenous Native Hawaiians. For the sake of reconciliation, the Hawaii Conference of the UCC offered a multi-million-dollar reparations package in addition to what the national UCC had pledged. They gave $28,000 to each of the 48 Native Hawaiian churches in existence in 1893 or its successors, committed $1.5 million in trust to the newly created Puya Foundation to serve the Native Hawaiian community, and transferred 6 valuable parcels of land on 5 islands to Native Hawaiian churches and the Puya Foundation. So what is remarkable to me about these UCC apologies is that they are an example, however imperfect, of a religious community leading a secular nation in the difficult work of repair, as their redress efforts preceded Congress's own. On November 23rd, 1993, Congress officially apologized for the illegal overthrow of the Kingdom of Hawaii and for therein depriving the rights of Native Hawaiians for self-determination. Congress even specifically recognized and commended efforts at reconciliation initiated by the state of Hawaii and the UCC with Native Hawaiians. Our federal lawmakers, however, did not provide monetary reparations, nor did they return any land. Today, the Hawaii sovereignty movement is growing. You know this, Greg Johnson here, researching this, and other folks. And while there are different positions on the exact form the sovereignty should take, so some are calling for the restoration of the kingdom, others are calling for federal recognition of Native Hawaiians akin to American Indian tribes and Alaska Natives, and still others are calling for Hawaii to be decolonized under the terms laid out by the UN in the 1940s for occupied territories. So again, there's internal disagreement, but they all coalesce and converge on the importance of who controls the land. Okay, so as historically aggrieved groups the world over continue to press for reparations and increasingly receive them, at least in partial measure, the question remains how justice-seeking peoples of goodwill ought to respond. And so what I want to do now is move into the second part of my presentation, and I'll begin that by defining how I'm understanding the term reparations. So I'm drawing upon the broad definition that Antonio Raimundo, who is an attorney activist in the Filipino redress movement, his definition, which I've reproduced here. So reparations are programs that are justified on the basis of a historic group harm, and number 2, they are designed to assess and correct that harm and or improve the lives of the victims in the future. So as the term group-based harm suggests, victims have been targeted on account of a characteristic or identity they share with others, such as their race or ethnicity, nationality, religion, or sex. These group-based harms are described as historic, not only because they took place in the past, but also because they were particularly injurious or systemic. Of course, redress activists are keen to show that the past harm endures to the present day, typically either because the original injustice exudes a lingering effect on contemporary relations among peoples, or because the unjust benefits gained by one group at the expense of another continues to be enjoyed by descendants or successive generations of the perpetrators to the detriment of the victim's descendants. So while the term reparations colloquially often refers to money, I would encourage us to use the more expansive understanding provided by the emerging international standard for reparations in an important 2005 UN resolution. And these are usually called the Van Boven Principles. And the Van Boven Principles recognizes 5 forms. So first is restitution, where victims are restored, where possible, to the original situation before the violation. Second is compensation, where victims receive, for any economically accessible damage, an amount proportional to the gravity of the violation and the circumstances of each case. Third is rehabilitation, which may involve medical and psychological care and legal and social services. Fourth is satisfaction, which a category which may include public apologies and official memorials and tributes that restore the victim's dignity, reputation, and rights. And fifth is guarantees of non-repetition, such as through promoting mechanisms for preventing and monitoring social conflicts and their resolution. Okay. All right, so while Christians, like other conscientious citizens, should assess any proposal for reparations on a case-by-case basis, there are classical church teachings and practices that could provide support for the overall prospect, or so this is my argument. To begin with, restitution and compensation are biblical concepts in Mosaic law, Levitical codes, and in Jesus' own teaching. Consider Jesus' positive response to Zacchaeus, the tax collector's pledge to pay back 4 times as much to anyone he has defrauded. In addition, liturgical practices of confession are designed for parishioners to repent of the ways they have fallen short, not just as individuals, but also in their common life with others, as well as in their participation in sinful social structures. Now, in the Reformed tradition with which I identify, we can additionally turn to an extraordinary document from the Global South, and that is the Belhar Confession. Originally adopted by the Synod of the Dutch Reformed Mission Church in South Africa in 1986 in response to apartheid, the Belhar Confession obliges the church to work for unity, reconciliation, and justice by standing by people in any form of suffering and need and striving against any form of injustice. Belhar confesses that God is in a special way the God of the destitute, the poor, and the wronged, and thus the church must stand where the Lord stands, namely with the wronged. When my denomination, the Presbyterian Church USA, added Belhar to its Book of Confessions in 2016, this was tantamount to the PCUSA accepting Belhar as a doctrinal standard of faith, along with the Nicene Creed. That's the we believe in the one God, Father, Almighty, maker of all heavenly things, if you're familiar with that. And the more recent Barmen Declaration of the 20th century, that is the confession against the theological claims of the Nazi state and the Arianization of the church in Germany. The call to reparations follows logically from Belhar's articulation of the church's responsibilities. Again, this is the argument I'm trying to make. What's more, in adopting the 2000 report of the PCUSA Task Force to study issues of reparations, the PCUSA General Assembly echoed the aforementioned themes in affirming that, from a Christian perspective, reparations is not so much about assigning blame to individuals or groups of people as it is about recognizing that we the people, citizens of the United States, are sometimes found culpable for the harm done to others because of our government's laws and policies and our social practices. It is for those times that we must, as a nation and a church, repent of our sins against our sisters and brothers, diligently attempt to repair any breach in relationship that has been caused, and do our best to redress any and all injustices visited upon innocent people. The task force called upon the denomination to take action in the political sphere, such as by advocating for legislation related to reparations and reconciliation, and encouraging elected representatives to acknowledge the evils of racism through public apologies and memorials to victims of group-based harms. I should add that the PCUSA also launched in 2024 a Center for the Repair of Historic Harms, where the primary goal is to recognize, acknowledge, and repair the harm caused to Indigenous peoples, African Americans, and other marginalized groups, with the goal of inspiring repair and reconciliation both within and beyond the church. So essentially, I've been arguing that Christians, especially in the Reformed tradition, they should be predisposed to think and act in the ways that reparations require. Now, what I lack space to explain, although we can pick it up in the Q&A, is why there nonetheless exists so much resistance to the idea of reparations in the US, including, I would say, actually, especially, unfortunately, among Christians. But we're going to bracket that, and I now want to turn to what we can learn from the AAPI community in light of the cases that I made. Okay, so I want to offer that Asian American experiences make Asian American scholar activists who know of them well positioned to develop an approach to reparations that could ultimately serve the common good. Our contribution potential is due to 3 factors. So first, we have longevity. So it is one group, Chinese Americans, who filed the first lawsuit with multiple plaintiffs for reparations ever in the US in 1886, and that's the Wing King versus the City of Eureka case, and who have a history of fighting back against group-based harms through legal channels. Second, we Asian Americans have had some success. It was one of our redress cases, the Japanese American one, that's been widely hailed as a political triumph, moral baseline, and aspirational ideal for others. And third, as I mentioned before, we have been on both sides of the reparations giving and receipt, right? And with the case of the Native Hawaiians, we have been on the giving end. Okay, so finally turning to my last section, what I want to do now is unpack 5 principles that I see emerging from these various considerations. And again, this is a non-exhaustive list of principles. It's a work in progress, one that I very much want to refine and develop when I move into heavy research for my book. So here they go, 5 principles. Number 1, to seek reparations that facilitate repair. First, an Asian American theology of reparations should support measures that have the potential to be socially and psychologically reparative to the aggrieved communities. While a full restoration of broken lives and reconciliation of broken relationships may not be possible in this life, we know that some healing is possible. For instance, in advocating for reparations that foster the mending of tears in the social fabric and correct for breaches in the polity, Eric Yamamoto, who is the Fred T. Korematsu Professor of Law and Social Justice at the University of Hawaii School of Law, has written poignantly about the cathartic release many Japanese Americans experience when the nation finally accounted for its wrongs. In his words, former internees could finally talk about the internment. Feelings long repressed surfaced. One woman, now in her 60s, stated that she always felt the internment was wrong, but after being told by the military, the president, and the Supreme Court that it was a necessity, she had come to seriously doubt herself. Redress and reparations, she said, had now freed her soul. Some Filipino World War II vets also experienced a similar catharsis during the moving ceremony at the Capitol when receiving the Congressional Gold Medal. With 21 veterans, some 700 family members, and key members of Congress present, a 100-year-old vet who accepted the award on the group's behalf said, with tears streaming and voice cracking, that thousands of us had felt underappreciated and unrecognized for fighting for our country, but now this day had finally come. The formal recognition by Congress, in the words of the chairman of the Filipino Veterans Recognition and Education Project, had finally healed a wound that they had lived with for most of their lives. All right, principle number 2. The healing potential raises the stakes for reparations to be received well by their intended audience. But therein lies the challenge. The sincerity of an apology is easier to detect among persons than when collectives, particularly governments, express sorrow for past misdeeds. States can demonstrate both the grasp of the severity of the harm and the genuineness of their contrition by dedicating sizable resources to their reparative efforts. We can turn again to the Japanese American case for illustration. Many Japanese Americans found restorative of their dignity and an integral part of the healing process the creation of the Public Education Fund and the work that came out of it, including the Smithsonian's Permanent Incarceration and Reparations exhibit and the National Memorial in Washington, D.C., because the nation had incorporated into its official history their unjust suffering. Now, while $20,000 to each surviving incarceree was, strictly speaking, a derisory amount, it did not actually reflect the fair market value of the total property and assets Japanese Americans had lost. Most in the community ultimately embraced the reparations because the formal apology itself was significant and the sum close to the amount the JACL had requested. Now, the significance of money can also be seen in the Filipino case, but this time negatively. While the 1996 presidential proclamation helpfully set the historical record straight in acknowledging that Filipinos had played an instrumental role in World War II as they fought alongside of US and Allied forces, the American public was not asked to do anything more than simply recall the courage, sacrifice, and loyalty of Filipino veterans in a day marked out to honor them. It was not until more than a decade later when individual Filipino vets received lump sum payments. This delay might help to explain its mixed reception. Some vets no longer felt dishonored, while others felt disappointed, either because only a fraction were still alive to receive the money or because the amount did not seem nearly enough. Remember, 9,000, 15,000. This piecemeal and begrudging rollout of remedies serves as a cautionary tale, underscoring the importance of committing sufficient resources the first time around to preclude the need for any successive attempts. All right, next principle. Third, sometimes when remedies are inadequate, it's not primarily due to finances, but because the representatives of the perpetrators failed to do one crucial thing, and that is to actually apologize. In the Chinese American case, despite headlines to the contrary, Congress never apologized. The House of Representatives only expressed regret for the passage of legislation that adversely affected people of Chinese origin. The Senate had gone slightly further. They deeply regretted past discriminatory laws and reaffirmed their commitment to preserving the same civil rights and constitutional protections to people of Chinese or other Asian descent. But they too neglected to say sorry. There is, however, a crucial difference between expressing regret and apologizing. As the California legislature wisely noted in 2014, genuine apologies acknowledge wrongdoing and the role one played as the wrongdoer, while regret entails only sorrow for the turn of events or a wish that something else might have happened instead, while sidestepping the central issue of fault. Congress's non-apology becomes even more problematic when we compare it to the formal apologies they have provided, most without monetary reparations, to other groups. Because regret is not sufficient, the House and the Senate should follow California's lead in formally apologizing to Chinese Americans. All right, fourth principle, Fourth, as reparation movements lie at the intersection of ethics, law, and politics, and as they draw upon religiously infused concepts of atonement, forgiveness, and reconciliation, we must acknowledge that even theologically sound and morally unassailable calls for redress may be legally or legislatively difficult to win or politically impractical to pursue. So dreams of reparations thus require sober elements of realism. Their transformative potential must be prudentially assessed alongside of the hazards of mobilizing to demand them. So I was chatting with Dusty and Greg beforehand. This is probably not the moment to be lobbying Congress for political reasons that I think most of you can appreciate. All right. Given Christianity's historic profession that it's truth that sets us free, one risk to which any theology of reparations should be attentive is that of victims distorting their lived experience in pursuit of reparations. For example, to garner political support, the overwhelming narrative that Japanese Americans in congressional testimony provided was that they had been loyal super patriots, that they had compliantly gone to the camps without resistance, and that the highly decorated and segregated 442 Regimental Combat Team, comprised of Nisei soldiers, had been incredibly heroic in their willingness to fight and die abroad for the very country that was incarcerating their beloved family members and friends at home. Now, intentionally left unmentioned, however, was the known history of draft resistors, rioters, work and hunger strikers, and the no-nos. Those are the Japanese Americans incarcerated who answered no to two very difficult questions on what became known as the loyalty questionnaire. So this calculated framing of Japanese Americans may have helped to bring about a win, but I would argue at the cost of misrepresenting to the public the true history of what had transpired. Now, to a lesser extent, something similar could be said about the Chinese American case. The House resolution acknowledges that many Chinese came to the US in search of opportunities to create a better life. Both resolutions paint a picture of Chinese Americans as long-suffering victims who contributed to the nation's economic growth, but not as persons who often fought back, sometimes physically, with arms purchased from China, nor as occasionally perpetrators of serious crimes themselves. So part of the lesser-known history of early Chinese immigration involves the trafficking of women, many of whom had been kidnapped to work as enslaved prostitutes in California. So approximately 1,000 women in San Francisco's Chinatown in the 1890s were in bondage, primarily for sex. So of course I acknowledge the wisdom of presenting one's claims in ways that would garner public support and sympathy from legislative and judicial power brokers, of course. But I would still discourage gross admissions or distortions of the truth for political gain. All right, so final principle. The fifth and final principle takes its cues from my claim in my co-edited anthology, Asian American Christian Ethics, that our contextualized approach to Christian ethics is intended for the benefit of all. That is, these principles may emerge from reflecting on Asian American case studies, but they are designed to contribute more broadly to the pursuit of intergenerational justice writ large. The PCUSA Task Force on Reparations notes a special need to take seriously reparation proposals for slavery. I, too, would encourage my community toward that end, not just because of its egregiousness and devastating legacies, but also because several Asian American cases owe a conceptual debt to the unfulfilled African American one. That first ever lawsuit in the US for reparations filed by 53 Chinese Americans in 1886, while legally framed in terms of negligence, The idea behind it was sparked by post-Civil War talk of compensating newly freed enslaved persons with 40 acres and a mule. The success of Japanese American case for reparations, one of the movement's leading activists and a former incarceree herself, Yuri Kochiyama, first came to the concept of reparations by agitating for it for African Americans in the late 1960s when she was a member of the Black nationalist organization, the Republic of New Africa. So with solidarity as the goal, Asian Americans campaigning for redress should acknowledge the possibility that they might face opposition or resentment from other groups. Still, a win for one group need not come at the expense of others, but actually could set helpful legal precedents for outstanding cases. So we saw this with survivors of the Rosewood, Florida massacre. These are persons who saw their entire town destroyed by racially motivated mob violence, and some residents lynched after a white woman's false allegation of assault in 1923, because the Rosewood folks drew upon the Japanese American redress case, and they ultimately won a $2.1 million settlement and an apology, and this was in 1994. So in sum, Asian Americans who reject the divide and conquer strategy of the model minority myth should do whatever they can to work in concert, not in competition, with other victims of group-based harms. All right, so my conclusion. Most of us know that the past is never simply the past. Even if all direct victims and all original perpetrators are long gone, and even if reparative measures have brought about some good to survivors or descendants, we can still draw a direct line between the historical wrongdoing and present realities. We can connect the anti-Chinese racism of the exclusion era with ongoing anti-Asian, especially anti-Chinese sentiments today that was especially heightened during the pandemic. We can connect Executive Order 9066 and the shrinkage of approximately 40 Japantowns during World War II to the three that remain, in addition to the very recent White House invocation of the Aliens Enemy Act. We can connect the 1946 Recessions Act to the disproportionate number of Filipino American vets who have lived without adequate care or family reunification. We can also connect the overthrow of the Kingdom of Hawaii to the painful statistics that Native Hawaiians only comprise about 6% of the total Hawaiian population today, but have the highest rates of incarceration, homelessness, suicide, and major diseases. Today, redress activism among the 4 AAPI groups that I mentioned continue today, and of course, other groups are engaged in redress efforts of their own. Reparations, when done well, or even adequately, compel societies mired in historic wrongdoing and social sin to own up to their past, so as to liberate victims of group-based harms and advance the cause of intergenerational justice. This, to me, is a most worthy and holy task. Thank you.